I mean, there are two major things that I've seen change in the 20 years that I've been with the World Trade Organization. The first thing is when I joined them, the organization was under pressure and under criticism, mostly from civil society groups. They were very unfamiliar with the organization and what it stood for, and therefore criticized what came out of it or was supposed to come out of it. That has completely changed. There is much less civil society interest. There's much more business interest. And that, adds to the sort of second change. The organization has been under fire for quite a long time now. We have not been able to deliver many outcomes of negotiated agreements, whereas the private sector has a growing interest in the organization, has shown a growing interest, has been more, interactive on these matters. So that, for me, has been the biggest change. Early days, civil society groups criticizing an unknown organization to them, completely reversed. We now have the private sector joining us.
Excellent. And do you think, especially now as the new year comes into play, we have many things that could have gone wrong, very bad so, or depending on who you ask, could have gone very wrong and could have left the WTO to really solve a lot of messes, including things like Brexit, which luckily, in the 11th hour, they managed to secure something which resembled a deal, which really led them to not use the WTO as a place to fight out their international trade disputes. But do you think now with the US-China trade war, with what could have happened with Brexit, do you think this is just the beginning of more flare-ups in the world as a nation's sense of power, the idea that we've developed as a firm, as different nations grow in their economical power and in their ability to attract different businesses to their active consumer markets? Do you see more issues coming up in the future? And if so, how do you think the WTO can be a mediator, especially when you have more rising powers who are going to have a bigger voice as the years go on? How does the WTO bring them together and keep them together at the negotiating table, as opposed to them saying, you know what, this is not working for us, therefore we're going to use our own ways to solve these disputes, which may not be in the international interest?
I think it's very important to first reiterate that, the organization was set up to actually not only monitoring trade agreements, not only negotiate further rules and disciplines in the area of trade, but also to provide a territory, an area, a platform, whatever you want to call it, for members to indeed discuss their differences and hopefully find a solution to their problems or differences. Now, that, as much as it has been functioning for a very long time at a very good level and high level, has been deteriorating a little bit in the last few years, because we cannot force members of the organization, to come to us and deal with these matters. If you and I would be members of the organization, we would be bound by a lot of matters. But if at the end we decide to have an issue, have an argument, and fight it out outside of the organization, there's no one going to say, if you don't do that, we're going to do this or that to you. And that's a little bit of the dilemma we're faced over the last few years. And this is something that, and I'm very careful to speculate, but something that will probably continue in the future, or at least in the short-term future, because there's no real indication that what has happened between countries like the United States, China, European Union, and others will not continue, at least in the very first phase.
This may not be the case, but are there any other competitors to the WTO that you see coming from other parts of the world? We have, for example, the World Bank as a Western institution, but then you have, Russia and China also developing their own versions of funding for nations who maybe go elsewhere if there was an option and they created that option.
Competition. I don't think. At the risk of sounding arrogant here, which I don't want to, I don't think there's an international organization that does something that we do. There is no competition. You mentioned the World Bank. There are others. They do completely different things. They may focus on trade. They may do analysis of trade and trade policy. They may even use trade policy as a lever or as an argument to finance or to support. But they don't deal with, setting the rules of trade between nations, which is what the WTO does. You mentioned at the very end something which some people see as competition, and those are, a couple of countries coming together and creating like a regional trade bloc, and that grows. And you have, I think all of our members are involved in some kind of bilateral, or as we call it, plurilateral, more than two, countries in some kind of agreement on the way they treat each other's trade. And of course, the bigger it gets, the more influential it becomes. And there have been recent examples of those. And the most recent one is something which is in development, is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. If that comes into force and comes into play completely, you have a huge trading bloc, which we don't see as competition, but some other people say it is. We see it as testing grounds. These bilateral, plurilateral trade negotiations between nations is often where they try out new areas, new rules. Imagine data flow, imagine electronic commerce, imagine corporations for the support of small and medium enterprises. All of that is not covered by the WTO. They are currently talking about it, negotiating, but it's not covered yet. And it's much easier, as you can understand, to come to some sort of agreement between 2, 3, or 4 countries than it is between 164. So competitive international intergovernmental organizations, not really. In terms of trading blocks, it's not so much competition.
If you'd like to hear this interview in its entirety, then head on over to SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other major podcast platform and search Four Corners Podcast.